The Battle of Schellenberg, also known as the Battle of Donauworth, was fought on the 2nd of July 1704 during the War of the Spanish Succession. The engagement was part of the Duke of Marlborough's campaign to save the Habsburg capital of Vienna from a threatened advance by King Louis XIV. Franco-Bavarian forces ranged in southern Germany. Marlborough had commenced his 250-mile march from Bedburg, near Cologne, on the 19th of May. Within 5 weeks he had linked his forces with those of the Margrave of Baden, before continuing on to the river Danube. Once in southern Germany, the Allies' task was to induce Max Emanuel, the Elector of Bavaria, to abandon his allegiance to Louis XIV and rejoin the Grand Alliance. But to force the issue, the Allies first needed to secure a fortified bridgehead and magazine on the Danube, through which their supplies could cross to the south of the river into the heart of the Elector's lands. For this purpose, Marlborough selected the town of Donauworth. Once the Elector and his co-commander, Marshal Marsin, knew of the Allies' objective, they dispatched Count Darco with an advance force of 12,000 men from their main camp at Dillingen to strengthen and hold the Schellenberg heights above the town. Rejecting a protracted siege, Marlborough decided in favor of a quick assault, before the position could be made impregnable. After 2 failed attempts to storm the barricades, the Allied commanders, acting in unison, finally managed to overwhelm the defenders. It had taken just 2 hours to secure the bridgehead over the river in a hard-fought contest, but following the victory, momentum was lost to indecision. The deliberate devastation of the Elector's lands in Bavaria failed to bring Max Emanuel to battle or persuade him back into the imperial fold. Only when Marshal Tallard arrived with reinforcements to strengthen the Elector's forces, and Prince Eugene of Savoy arrived from the Rhine to bolster the Allies, was the stage finally set for the decisive action at the Battle of Blenheim the following month. Background: the Battle of Schellenberg was part of the Grand Alliance's campaign of 1704 to prevent the Franco-Bavarian army from threatening Vienna, the capital of Habsburg Austria. The campaign began in earnest on the 19th of May when the Duke of Marlborough began his 250-mile march from Bedburg near Cologne towards the Elector of Bavaria's and Marshal Marsin's Franco-Bavarian army on the Danube. Marlborough had initially deceived the French commanders, Marshal Villeroy in the Spanish Netherlands and Marshal Tallard along the Rhine, into thinking his target was Alsace or the Moselle farther to the north. However, when the Elector was notified on the 5th of June of Marlborough's march from the Low Countries, he had correctly predicted that it was his Principality of Bavaria that was the Allies' real target. Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I was keen to lure the Elector back into the imperial fold after he had switched allegiance to fight for King Louis XIV. Before the war. Given this duplicity, Marlborough thought the best way to secure Bavaria for the alliance was to negotiate from a position of strength by invading the Elector's territories, hoping to persuade him to change sides before he could be reinforced. By the 22nd of June, Marlborough's army had linked up with elements of the Margrave of Baden's imperial forces at Launtheim. By the end of June their combined strength totaled nearly 80,000 men. The Franco-Bavarian army camped at Ulm were numerically inferior to the Allies, and a large part of the Elector's troops were scattered about garrisons in his territories as far as Munich and the Tyrolese frontier. But his position was far from desperate. If he could hold out for a month, Tallard would arrive from the Rhine with French reinforcements. Once the Allies had combined their forces, the Elector and Marsin moved their 40,000 troops into the entrenched camp between Dillingen and Leungen on the north bank of the Danube. The Allied commanders, unwilling to attack such a strong position rendered impregnable by redoubts and inundations, passed round Dillingen to the north through Balmershofen and Armedingen in the direction of Donauworth. If captured, the bridgehead at Donauwörth would offer new communications with the friendly states in central Germany by way of Nordlingen and Nuremberg, as well as providing a good crossing place over the Danube for resupply when the Allies were south of the river. Prelude. Schellenberg's defences. The Schellenberg Heights dominate the skyline to the northeast of Donauwörth, the walled town on the confluence of the Wernitz and Danube rivers, with one flank of the hill protected by dense, impenetrable trees of the Boschberg wood. However, its oval-shaped summit was flat and open, and its 70-year-old defences, including an old fort built by the Swedish king Gustavus Adolphus during the 30 Years' War, were neglected and in a dilapidated state. When the unexpected attack took place, the bastions, the curtain, and the ditch were fairly complete along the long eastern face from the shore of the Danube to the wooded hilltop. But in the shorter section from the wood to the fort, the angle where Marlborough's attack was delivered, the earthwork had been more hastily made up of facens of brushwood thinly covered with soil. The western section of the lines ran steeply downhill from the fort to the city walls. Here, there was little to show in terms of defences, but to compensate the line could be protected by a flanking fire from the town. In 1703 Marshal Villars had advised the Elector to fortify his towns, and above all the Schellenberg, that fort above Donauwörth, the importance of which the great Gustavus taught us. The Elector, whose relationship with Villars had since collapsed, had initially ignored the advice to repair the decaying defences. But once it was realized that Donauwörth was to be attacked, Count Darco, a Piedmontese officer, was dispatched from the camp at Dillingen with orders to strengthen and hold the position. Darco was entrusted with 12,000 men, most of whom were drawn from Bavaria's best units, including the Elector's Guards and the regiment of the Prince Electoral, led by veteran officers. In total, the garrison defending the Schellenberg consisted of 16 Bavarian and 7 French infantry battalions, 6 squadrons of French and 3 squadrons of Bavarian dragoons, supported by 16 guns. In addition, Donauwörth was held by a French battalion and 2 battalions of Bavarian militia. Initial maneuvers. On the night of 1–2 July, the Allies were camped at Almedingen, 15 miles from Donauwörth. It was here when Marlborough received an urgent message from Baron Multenberg, Prince Eugene's adjutant general, that Marshal Tallard was marching with 35,000 troops through the Black Forest to reinforce the Franco-Bavarian army. This news convinced Marlborough that he did not have time for a protracted siege in. Despite protestations from Baden, arguing that a direct assault would incur severe casualties, the Duke planned for an outright assault on the position. Darco knew of the whereabouts of the Allied camp at Armedingen, and was confident he had at least a full day and night to prepare his defences. At 300 on the 2nd of July, the Allied advance guard began to break camp for the march towards Donauwörth and the Schellenberg Heights. Marlborough personally oversaw the advance of the initial assault force of 5,850 foot, drawn up in groups of approximately 130 men from each battalion under his command. The Dutch general Johan Wijnand van Gaal would lead this vanguard. Behind these stormers came 12,000 Allied infantry in 2 echelons, each of 8 battalions under Major General Henry Withers and Count Horn, supported by Henri Lumley's and Graaf Reynad van Hompesch's 35 squadrons of British and Dutch cavalry and dragoons. Baden, whose wing of the army marched behind Marlborough's, would hold a brigade of Imperial Grenadiers ready for action when the opportunity came, as there was insufficient room in front of the Schellenberg for them to fully deploy. In all, the Allies were deploying 22,000 men in the operation. Riding far ahead of the army, Marlborough personally examined the enemy position, observing through his telescope preparations for a camp on the far side of the river in expectation of the arrival of the Elector's main force the following day. There was, therefore, no time to be lost. Although the Duke had 12 hours of light remaining in the day, his men were still struggling in the mud, miles away behind the river Wernitz, and they could not hope to launch the attack before about 1800, leaving just 2 hours before nightfall. As the Allies marched, work on the defences of Donauworth and the Schellenberg were proceeding in earnest. With the aid of French engineer officers, Darco started to repair and strengthen the 2 miles of old entrenchments that connected the fort of Gustavus with the Danube on one side, and the town walls on the other. A French commander in Bavarian service and chronicler of the period, Colonel Jean-Martin de la Coligny, later wrote, "The time left to us was too short to complete this satisfactorily." The Allied cavalry began to appear at about 800, 5 miles or 6 miles away on Darco's left front to the northwest, followed by the infantry. By 1000, Marlborough's quartermaster general, William Cadogan, began to mark out land for an encampment within sight of the Schellenberg, short of the Wernitz, to give the impression they were intending the leisurely siege. Count Darco watched Cadogan's preparations and, falling for the deception, left the supervision of the still incomplete defences to lunch with the French commander of Donauworth, Colonel Dubourdet, safe in the belief that he had the rest of the day and night to finish the defences. However, the columns marched purposefully onwards, and by mid-afternoon they had crossed the river Wernitz at Abermorgen, intent on launching an immediate assault. The Allies were spotted by the Bavarian outposts who, after setting fire to Berg and surrounding hamlets, rushed off to sound the alarm. General Darco, rudely interrupted from his lunch, rushed up the Schellenberg and called his men to arms.